The transition from the final, stubborn snows of late April into the aggressive expansion of the Alaskan spring was a period of mechanical and structural violence. Elara sat in the driver's seat of her RV, her hands gripping the wheels so hard the plastic groaned, staring at the monolithic dome that rose out of the thawing silt like the crown of an ancient, unbared skull. The dome was the center of a design she had spent 3 years perfecting, a seamless shell of steel-reinforced concrete and polyurethane foam that was meant to be the ultimate expression of a closed-loop life support system. As the engine of the RV ticked and cooled in the sharp mountain air, the sound of the big thaw was a constant subterranean roar, the sound of millions of gallons of meltwater carving new arteries through the mud and shifting the ancient permafrost. She didn't move for several minutes, allowing the silence of the cab to settle. The dashboard was covered in a fine layer of dust, a testament to the thousands of miles she had covered since the infrastructure of the lower 48 began to fracture and dissolve. In the passenger seat sat a stack of technical manuals, and her primary Kindle, its screen dark. Mark should have been there, checking the GPS coordinates or joking about the insulation R value of their new home. But Mark was a memory buried under the rubble of a city that had forgotten how to maintain itself. Elara was alone, but she was not empty-handed. She had the design, the resources, and the technical obsession required to turn this concrete shell into a functioning organism. She stepped out into the mud, her boots sinking 6 inches into the saturated, golden-gray silt. The air smelled of wet moss and the metallic tang of melting ice. To her left, the 40-foot shipping container sat on its gravel pad. Its rusted red painted a stark contrast to the gray-green of the rising tundra. This container held the guts of the operation: the monocrystalline solar panels, the lithium iron phosphate battery banks, the high-efficiency geothermal fans, and the crates of powdered milk and powdered heavy cream she had manufactured herself in the final months of the old world. Her first priority was not comfort. It was the atmosphere. A monolithic dome, by its very nature, was an airtight pressure vessel. Without a constant engineer exchange of air, the interior would become a stagnant trap for carbon dioxide and moisture, leading to mold at best and hypoxia at worst. She approached the north-facing curve of the dome, where the geothermal intake vents had been precast into the concrete. The engineering of the earth tubes was a cornerstone of her thermal management. She had pre-laid 4 runs of 6-inch diameter, heavy-duty corrugated pipe 6 feet beneath the permafrost line during the initial foundation pour. At this depth, the earth maintained a constant temperature of approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit. By pulling the raw, 35-degree spring air through these subterranean runs, the air would be tempered by the earth, entering the dome at a steady, dry temperature without the need for energy-intensive heaters. She spent the next 6 hours in the mud, connecting the exterior intake manifolds to the internal ductwork. She installed the high-static pressure brushless DC fans, wiring them into a temporary lead-acid battery array she had salvaged from the RV. When she flipped the switch, the fans hummed to life with a low, vibrational frequency. She walked inside the dome, the interior a vast, echoing chamber of raw gray concrete. She held a strip of tissue paper to the vent. It fluttered instantly. The dome was breathing. It was the first sign of technical life in a structure that had, until then, been nothing more than a tomb of rebar and foam. With the air exchange stabilized, Elara turned her attention to the power grid. The Alaskan spring provided a unique challenge. The light was returning in a tidal wave of photons, with the sun staying above the horizon for nearly 18 hours a day, but it hung low, casting long, weak shadows across the ridge. She needed to maximize the harvest. She spent 3 days unboxing a 400-watt monocrystalline solar panels. She chose monocrystalline over polycrystalline for its superior efficiency in low-light conditions and its better temperature coefficient, essential for the high-intensity light of the coming summer. She climbed the exterior of the dome, her boots gripping the textured sealant she had applied during the build. She mounted the racks to the south-facing curve, using specialized concrete anchors that she sealed with industrial-grade silicone to prevent moisture intrusion and freeze-thaw cracking. The wiring was a meticulous process of crimping MC4 connectors and running heavy-gauge DC cables through the precast conduits into utility room, a reinforced, sound-insulated chamber tucked into the north quadrant of the dome. Inside the utility room, she staged a battery bank. She had opted for 24-280 lithium iron phosphate cells, wired in a series parallel configuration to create a massive 48-volt reservoir. Unlike traditional lead-acid batteries, these could be discharged to 80% without structural damage, giving her a deep well of energy for the high-draw periods of the summer. As she tightened the final terminal bolts with a torque wrench, she felt a sense of profound relief. The charge controllers began to beep, their digital displays showing a steady climb in voltage as the low spring sun hit the panels. To supplement the solar, she installed a vertical axis wind turbine on a reinforced mast at the crown of the dome. Horizontal turbines were prone to failure in the erratic, swirling katabatic winds of the Alaskan ridges, but a vertical axis design could catch wind from any direction without the need for a tail vane. As the blades began to spin, a silent, flickering blur against the gray sky, the monolith's heartbeat strengthened. It was no longer a passive object. It was a power facility. The interior build-out followed a strictly functional logic. Elara spent the next 2 weeks constructing the living quarters using reclaimed cedar planks and steel framing. She built a loft for her sleeping area, taking advantage of the natural heat stratification that occurred in the dome's curvature. Beneath the loft, she established her workstation. This was the nerve center of the homestead. She installed a 12 terabytes media server, housed in a cool, dust-proof rack, and synced it to her collection of Kindles. The server was filled with every technical manual, documentary, and database she could acquire. It held the mirrored Wikipedia database, thousands of PDFs on anaerobic digestion, veterinary surgery, textile chemistry, and heritage livestock breeding. She was a digital native who understood that her memory was a fragile, fallible thing. The Kindle library was her primary survival tool, more valuable than any rifle or axe. Every evening, exhausted from the physical labor of moving crates and bolting frames, she would sit at the granite-topped kitchen island and read. She studied the nitrogen to carbon ratios required for the methane digester she was about to build, her mind already calculating the flow rates and pressure requirements for the storage bladders. The most ambitious component of the loop was a geodesic greenhouse, a massive polycarbonate structure connected to the main dome by a reinforced, insulated transition door. To ensure year-round viability, she had designed the greenhouse to be a perfectly managed biodome. She spent 10 days building the raised garden beds out of high-strength concrete to prevent the rot and moisture issues associated with wood. She filled them with a rich mix of amended soil she had shipped in a container, a blend of peat vermiculite and composted manure. In the center of the greenhouse, she dug a 3-foot-deep pit for her orange tree. Settling the tree into the earth was the only moment of the month where her technical focus wavered. It was a piece of her old life, a living relic of the plan she and Mark had drafted in the quiet evenings before the world broke. As she patted the soil around its roots, she didn't allow herself to mourn. She only monitored. She checked the soil moisture with a digital probe and adjusted the drip irrigation lines. The tree was now part of the loop. The greenhouse was designed to be a closed-cycle nutrient system. She installed a large fish pond at the base of the south-facing wall, filling it with trout fingerlings. The trout provided the nitrogen for the plants through their waste, and the plants, in turn, filtered the water through a series of gravel-filled hydroponic troughs before the water was pumped back into the pond. It was a beautiful, efficient cycle that mimicked a natural ecosystem while remaining under her total mechanical control. She installed a network of sensors, pH, ammonia, dissolved oxygen, and nitrate, that fed directly to the monitors in her workspace. She could track the health of the entire greenhouse from her Kindle, making incremental adjustments to the pump speeds and the aeration levels to ensure the balance was maintained. The final structural components were the two smaller domes for the livestock connected to the greenhouse by short, reinforced corridors. These were not just for food, they were the primary fuel source for the entire operation. Elara had designed a DIY methane recovery system that utilized every ounce of waste produced by her 2 dairy cows and heritage pigs. The floors of the livestock domes were sloped at a 4-degree angle toward a central drainage point. This drainage led to an underground anaerobic digester, where bacteria broke down the manure and released methane gas. She spent a week plumbing the gas lines, installing scrubbers filled with iron oxide pellets to remove the corrosive hydrogen sulfide from the gas before it was piped into heavy-duty, reinforced storage bladders. This methane was her primary cooking fuel and her backup generator fuel for periods of low wind or light. She saved every cubic foot with a miser's focus, knowing that her energy independence depended on the efficiency of this biological reactor. One corner of the main dome's kitchen was dedicated to the dairy processing loop. Elara had brought a high-capacity, low-wattage dehydrator and a commercial-grade vacuum sealer. She knew that fresh milk was a luxury that consumed too much energy to store in its liquid form. Her solution was the manufacture of powdered milk and powdered heavy cream. She spent her afternoons processing the milk from the cows, separating the cream and dehydrating it at a precise 135 degrees to prevent the fats from going rancid. She then ground the dried flakes into a fine powder and vacuum sealed them into mylar bags. Each bag was dated and logged into her server's inventory. 20 pounds of powdered heavy cream represented nearly 60,000 calories of shelf-stable, high-density energy. It was the ultimate hedge against a breakdown in the primary production cycle. Despite the technical perfection of the systems, the isolation of the ridge was a constant, heavy presence. The silence of the dome was a physical weight, broken only by the hum of fans and the rhythmic sounds of the livestock. Elara was a woman of machines, but the human element was a variable she couldn't engineer away. She found herself checking the server constantly, playing old documentaries just to hear the sound of a human voice. She watched films she had seen a dozen times, using them as a white noise shield against the howling Alaskan wind that battered the concrete shell. She was a master of her domain, the architect of a closed loop that required no input from the outside world. But as the long spring days blurred into perpetual light of early summer, she realized that a perfect system with no purpose was just an expensive way to wait for the end. She spent more time in the greenhouse, talking to the orange tree, as if it were a colleague. She told it about the nitrogen cycles and the battery voltages, her voice sounding strange and brittle in the humid air. The tree didn't answer, but its growth was a tangible sign that life could persist if the engineering was sound. By the end of the first month, the monolith was no longer just a building. It was a functioning homestead. The systems were stabilized, the nutrient cycles were established, and the power grid was robust. Elara had moved from the RV into the dome, her life now governed by the rhythm of the machines. She woke to the sound of the geothermal fans, checked the methane pressures before breakfast, and spent her days in a state of constant methodical maintenance. She had built a fortress against the world, a technical sanctuary on the edge of the wilderness. She was ready for the summer, her mind already calculating the expansion of the garden beds and the optimization of the textile loop. She was the operator of the Alaskan escape, and for the first time since the cities began to burn, she felt that the math of her survival was finally adding up. The transition from late May into June brought the arrival of the long light. The sun no longer touched the horizon, circling the dome in a perpetual, golden arc that made sleep a matter of discipline rather than a natural response to darkness. This was the period of maximum production. The solar panels were saturated, their charge controllers humming at peak capacity. Elara used the surplus energy to run her more intensive industrial tools, including a small motorized carter and a spinning wheel she had set up in the utility corridor. She had brought enough cotton seed to start an experimental crop in the greenhouse, and she spent her evenings practicing the motions of spinning and weaving. She wasn't just making blankets. She was ensuring that her textile loop was as close as her food loop. She utilized the wool from a small flock of sheep she had traded for in the valley before the mountain pass became impassable. The smell of the raw wool, mixed with the metallic scent of the dome and the damp earth of the greenhouse, became the olfactory map of her new life. She spent the final week of the first month performing a full systems audit. She checked every weld, every electrical connection, and every seal in the methane lines. She recalibrated the sensors in the fish pond and replaced the primary filters in the geothermal intake. She was a woman who understood that in a closed loop, the smallest failure could cascade into a catastrophe. She lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, her Kindle always at her side, its screen displaying the real-time data of her world. She had survived the transition, the hardest month of the build, and as she looked out through the reinforced polycarbonate windows of the greenhouse at the vibrant green of the rising tundra, she knew that she had succeeded where so many others had failed. She had built a world that worked, a machine for living that was as indifferent to the chaos of the old world as the mountain itself. She was ready for the high summer, her hands callous, her mind sharp, and her loop secure. The livestock were the final variable she integrated into the daily schedule. The cows required milking twice a day, a process she had mechanized with a low-wattage vacuum pump powered by the solar array. The pigs were more self-sufficient, their waste being the primary driver of the methane digester. She had established a rotation for the greenhouse waste, feeding the trimmings from the vegetable beds to the pigs, who in turn fueled the stove that cooked her meals. Every calorie was accounted for, every watt was tracked, and every liter of water was recycled. It was a masterpiece of DIY engineering, a testament to what could be achieved when technical obsession was fueled by the necessity of survival. Elara stood at the center of the dome, the low hum of the fans a comforting tune in the background, and for the first time, she allowed herself a single moment of satisfaction. The Alaskan escape was operational. The stability of the dome's internal ecosystem was a fragile equilibrium based on consumption rates of a single human and a handful of livestock. In the first week of June, that math was shattered by the arrival of the mechanical death rattle of a failing internal combustion engine. Elara was on the roof of the monolith, checking the tension on the vertical axis wind turbine's mounting bolts, when the sound first echoed through the valley. It was a harsh, rhythmic knocking, the sound of a rod bearing disintegrating under the strain of the steep mountain grade. She didn't reach for a weapon. She reached for her radio and the digital readout of her perimeter sensors. A battered station wagon, its radiator venting a plume of white steam, limped into gravel turnaround and died. 5 people emerged from the vehicle, a man, a woman, and 3 girls. They were the physical embodiment of the world Elara had fled, hollow-eyed, covered in a fine patina of road dust, and radiating a level of desperation that was mathematically incompatible with a closed-loop system. Caleb, the father, was a man whose hands were mapped with the scars of career in industrial mechanics. His wife, Sarah, and their daughters, Maya, Sophie, and little Grace, stood in the shadow of the dome, looking at the concrete shell as if it were a mirage. The immediate technical reality was stark. 5 new humans meant a 500% increase in carbon dioxide production, a massive spike in water consumption, and a caloric demand that the current greenhouse cycle was not yet scaled to handle. "I'm a mechanic," Caleb said, his voice brittle from dehydration as he looked at the wind turbine Elara had just been servicing. "I can work the machines. I saw your array from the ridge. You've got a balance load, but your north side grounding looks weak for the summer lightning season. I can fix it. Just let the girls sit in the shade." Elara didn't invite them into the main dome. The monolith was her sanctuary, and she understood that introducing foreign microbes and unmanaged moisture into the airtight living quarters without a protocol was a recipe for systemic failure. Instead, she directed them to the livestock utility corridor, a transitional space heated by the geothermal exhaust and equipped with a basic sink and a composting head. "You stay there," Elara told them, her tone devoid of warmth but focused on the logistical necessity. "Caleb, if you want to eat, you help me scale the loop. Sarah, you'll be in the greenhouse. We need to double the nitrate processing in the fish pond by the end of the week, or the plants will starve under the new demand." The integration began with the water loop. The dome utilized a sophisticated gray water reclamation system that filtered sink and shower water through a series of multi-stage biological filters, sand, gravel, and activated charcoal, before it was used to flush the livestock stalls and then fed into the methane digester. With 6 people, the volume of gray water would quickly overwhelm the charcoal filters. Caleb spent his first 48 hours on the mountain, dismantling the station wagon's cooling system to scavenge the copper tubing and the heavy-duty fan. Under Elara's direction, he built a secondary aerated filtration tank, using a spare plastic drum from the cargo container. By increasing the oxygenation of the gray water, they accelerated the bacterial breakdown of soaps and organic matter, ensuring the water reaching the digester didn't kill the anaerobic bacteria. Sarah was assigned to the white loop, the dairy and preservation sector. Elara showed her the operation of the high-capacity dehydrator and the precise temperature controls required for manufacturing the powder-heavy cream. If the temperature fluctuates more than 3 degrees, the fats in the cream will oxidize, Elara explained, showing Sarah the digital logs on her Kindle. Oxidized fat goes rancid in the mylar bags. If that happens, we lose our most calorie-dense winter hedge. You monitor the sensors. If the voltage drops and the fans slow down, you switch the unit to the backup battery bank immediately. Sarah took to the task with a quiet, desperate focus. Within a week, the pantry shelf began to fill with new bricks of vacuum-sealed powder, the silver bags gleaming under the LED lights. The children were not exempt from the labor of the machine. Maya and Sophie, the teenagers, were put in charge of the biomass harvest. The greenhouse was growing at an explosive rate under the 24-hour Alaskan sun. The plants were producing more foliage than the fish waste could support, requiring a constant cycle of pruning and mulching. The girls used the trimmings to create a high-nitrogen compost tea that was cycled back into the hydroponic troughs. They also managed the fiber cycle, harvesting the first experimental crop of greenhouse cotton. Elara showed them how to use the motorized carding machine, a device she had rigged to run off the surplus solar power during the peak of the day. The sound of the carder, a rhythmic metallic whir, became the background noise of the afternoon, turning raw cotton and wool into soft roving for the spinning wheel. The presence of the family changed the dome from a hermit cell into a factory. The methane recovery system, which had been underutilized by Elara alone, was now operating at maximum capacity. The increased human and livestock waste meant the anaerobic digester was producing more methane than the bladders could hold. Caleb and Elara spent a series of long, golden evenings plumbing a secondary storage line. They salvaged the propane tank from the RV and modified the valves to accept the scrub methane. This gave them a high-pressure reservoir that could be used as a backup generator if the wind died during the transition into late summer. The pH in the digester is spiking, Caleb noted one morning, checking the digital probe he had installed at the drainage neck. The increased load is making the slurry too acidic. If we don't buffer it, the methane production will stall. Add the wood ash from the RV's old stove, Elara directed. The alkalinity will neutralize the acids, and check the iron oxide scrubbers. With this much gas moving through the lines, the sulfur will saturate the pellets in half the time. If hydrogen sulfide gets into the generator, it'll eat the valves in a month. The technical synergy between Elara and Caleb was immediate. While Elara provided the architectural logic and the data-driven oversight, Caleb provided the mechanical intuition of a man who had spent his life keeping dying machines alive. He found a vibration in the geothermal intake fan that Elara had missed, a loose bearing that would have shattered by midsummer. He machined a replacement sleeve from a scrap piece of the station wagon's axle, working on the small lathe in the utility room while the girls watched, fascinated by the curls of steel falling from the tool. Integration, however, was not just about the machines. The psychological pressure of 5 people living in a confined, high-stakes environment was a variable that Elara's Kindle could not monitor. The long light of June was starting to wear on the newcomers. The lack of darkness disrupted their circadian rhythms, leading to irritability and fatigue. Elara implemented a strict blackout schedule. At 2000 hours, the heavy insulated curtains she and Maya had woven were drawn over the polycarbonate panels. The interior lights were dimmed to a soft amber, mimicking the sunset the mountain refused to provide. The machine requires you to be functional, Elara told them during their first communal meal in the main dome. If you don't sleep, you make mistakes. If you make mistakes, the loop breaks. We don't have a margin for error. By the middle of June, the homestead's output had doubled. The fish pond was thriving, the trout growing large on a diet of high-protein larvae they cultivated from the livestock waste. A black soldier fly bioconverter Caleb had built. The plants in the greenhouse were a lush, verdant canopy, the orange tree in the center now covered in fragrant white blossoms. The scent of the citrus filled the dome, a strange, tropical anomaly in the subarctic air. Little Grace was given the task of pollination warden, using a small brush to transfer pollen from flower to flower, a manual substitute for the bees they didn't have. One afternoon, the methane pressure alarm triggered. A seal on the primary storage bladder had developed a micro fissure under the increased volume. Elara and Caleb were in the livestock dome within seconds, their headlamps cutting through the dim, cool air. The smell of raw methane, faintly sweet and dangerous, was present. Shut the intake valves. Elara barked. Caleb, get the vulcanizing tape and the industrial adhesive. We need to patch it while it's under pressure, or we'll lose the entire reservoir to the atmosphere. They worked in a silent, frantic synchronization. Caleb held the puncture closed with his gloved hand, while Elara applied the specialized sealant. They were inches away from a flammable gas that represented their primary fuel source for the coming months. If a spark had been introduced, the entire livestock dome would become a bomb. When the patch finally held and the pressure stabilized, they sat on the concrete floor, their chests heaving. That was too close, Caleb whispered, wiping grease from his forehead. The system is straining, Elara replied, looking at the Kindle readout. We're pushing the design limits of the original build. We need to add a secondary relief valve and another scrubber line. The math says we can support 6 people. But the hardware is telling a different story. We spend the next 3 days on hardening the infrastructure. No more production until the safety margins are back in the green. The girls, watching from the transition door, saw a version of adulthood they hadn't encountered in the camps or on the road. It wasn't about power or status. It was about the absolute responsibility of maintenance. They saw Elara and their father as the operators of a world that didn't care if they were tired or afraid. This realization matured them faster than any hardship on the road. Maya began to take over the daily calibration of the solar charge controllers, while Sophie managed the rotation of the hydroponic troughs, ensuring no single bed became nutrient depleted. The white loop was now their most successful sector. The 2 dairy cows, thriving on the high-quality forage grown in the greenhouse's auxiliary beds, were producing nearly 10 gallons of milk a day. Sarah had perfected the manufacture of the powdered milk, and the pantry was now stocked with enough high-density calories to last them through the end of the season and beyond. They also began to experiment with hard cheeses, using the natural cool of the Northside utility room for aging. Each wheel of cheese was a dense battery of protein and fat, a physical store of the summer's energy. As the second month of the homestead's operation drew to a close, the RV was finally dismantled. It had served its purpose as a temporary shelter and a source of parts. Caleb salvaged the electrical wiring, the glass, and the high-efficiency insulation. The metal frame was cut into sections to be used as structural reinforcement for a new storage shed they planned to build before the late summer rains arrived. The station wagon suffered the same fate, its alternator being converted into a secondary, hand-cranked generator for the children to use during the blackout hours as a form of exercise and energy production. The dome was no longer a solitary experiment. It was a village of 6. The Laum light continued to circle the ridge, a golden eye that watched over their labor. Elara stood at the kitchen island one evening. Looking at the monitors, the carbon dioxide levels were holding at 600 ppm, the water reservoir was at 90%, and the battery bank was fully charged by 1,400 hours every day. The loop was holding. The Alaskan escape had transitioned from a survivalist dream into a technical reality. We're hitting 95% efficiency on the nutrient recovery, Caleb said, leaning against the granite counter with a cup of mint tea grown in the greenhouse. I never thought I'd be happy about the pH of a pig's waste, but here we are. It's not about happiness, Caleb, Elara said, her eyes fixed on the power curve of the wind turbine. It's about the fact that the machines don't lie. If we take care of the loop takes care of us. We have 3 weeks until the peak of the summer heat. I want the secondary cooling loop for the greenhouse finished by then. If the trout pond hits 70 degrees, we lose the nitrogen cycle. I'll start the excavation for the heat sink tomorrow, Caleb replied. They sat in the quiet of the dome, the only sound the low, comforting hum of the geothermal fans. The world outside the valley was a distant, chaotic memory, but inside the monolith there was order, purpose, and the steady, mechanical pulse of life. They were the crew of the grounded ship, and they were finally beginning to trust the vessel. The height of the summer heat settled over the valley like a physical weight, pressing the scent of curing hay and ozone into the dry earth. In the heavy stillness of the afternoon, the solar array hummed with a low-frequency vibration that indicated peak efficiency, the silicon panels drinking in the unmitigated radiation of a sun that seemed trapped at its zenith. There was no sense of weeks passing, only the cyclical rhythm of the high-gain production season, where every hour of daylight was a resource to be harvested and stored. The irrigation system for the outer perimeter of the garden hissed rhythmically, throwing fine arcs of water into the air that evaporated almost before they touched the broad leaves of the squash and the heavy, ripening clusters of tomatoes. Inside the workshop, the air was cooler but thick with the smell of wood shavings and the scorched sugar scent of the small forge. Caleb worked with steady, unhurried precision, his movements reflecting a growing comfort with the tools Elara had provided. He was currently focused on the maintenance of the mechanical components for the small flour mill, ensuring the stone grinders were properly dressed and the drive belt was tensioned correctly. He didn't look like a man struggling to survive. He looked like a man who had finally found a task that allowed him to provide for his children in a way that felt tangible and permanent. Elara moved through the living space with a quiet efficiency, her mind constantly evaluating the stocks of preserved food and the integrity of the domestic systems. She had spent the morning processing the last of the early summer berries, turning them into dense fruit leathers and jars of preserves that glowed like rubies on the pantry shelves. Her approach to the household was one of steady, quiet support. She watched the way Sophie moved through the greenhouse, her smaller hands expertly pinching off the suckers on the tomato plants, and the way Maya maintained her distance while still performing the tasks required of her. Elara made sure to never overstep, never to demand an emotional vulnerability that wasn't ready to be given. She focused on the tangible, making sure there were clean clothes, that the meals were nutritious and filling, and that the house remained a sanctuary of order and safety. She knew the weight of the silence that sometimes settled over the girls, a silence born of the loss she could not fix but could only respect. She provided the infrastructure of their lives, the physical proof that the world was no longer a place of chaos, but a place where they were protected and valued. The domestic economy of the homestead had reached a state of high-yield productivity. The goats were at the peak of their lactation cycle, providing gallons of rich, creamy milk every day. Elara spent a significant portion of her time in the kitchen area, which had become a laboratory of preservation. The cooling system for the dairy cellar was working perfectly, maintaining a steady temperature that allowed for the aging of several large wheels of hard cheese, their rinds rubbed with oil and salt to protect them through the coming months. She also utilized the excess milk to create the powdered heavy cream that served as a shelf-stable luxury. The process was slow and required constant attention to the temperature of the dehydrator trays, ensuring the fat didn't go rancid while the moisture was slowly pulled away. Once dried into brittle sheets, she would grind it into a fine, ivory powder that could be reconstituted for coffee or used to enrich the calorie-dense stews they favored in the evenings. This work was meditative, a series of small, repeatable actions that anchored her to the reality of their survival. Maya and Sophie were often found in the weaving room during the hottest part of the day. The motorized carding machine, a device Elara had modified to run off the auxiliary battery bank, hummed as it processed the raw wool from their sheep into soft, uniform bats. Maya handled the machine with a technical proficiency that Elara admired. She watched the girl's hands, quick and sure, as she fed the fibers into the drum. There was a quietness to Maya that wasn't just silence. It was a guardedness, a wall built of memory and comparison. Elara acknowledged this without trying to tear it down. She would bring the girls cold herbal tea sweetened with honey, setting the glasses down on the workbench without interrupting their rhythm, offering a small nod of appreciation for the quality of the yarn they were producing. The blackout curtains for the new sleeping quarters were nearly finished. The heavy wool fabric designed to trap heat and provide a psychological barrier between the safety of the interior and the vast, unlit wilderness outside. The technical complexity of the homestead required constant vigilance, a task Elara shared with Caleb during the long summer evenings. They would sit on the porch, the air finally cooling enough to be comfortable, and discuss the health of the battery banks and the water levels in the primary cisterns. The solar pump in the lower pasture had been struggling with a slight air leak in the intake line, a minor issue that required a systematic teardrop and resealing of the joints. They approached these problems as a team, their conversation focused on the mechanics of their world. Caleb had a natural aptitude for physical labor, his hands-on experience as a pilot giving him a deep understanding of fluid dynamics and electrical systems. They never spoke of the world they had left behind or the single-pilot operations of his past life. Instead, they spoke of the torque required for the wind turbine bearings and the nutrient ratios for the hydroponic beds. This shared language of maintenance was the foundation of their partnership, a way of building trust through the mutual stewardship of their environment. The garden had become a lush, green fortress. The biomass harvest was at its peak, and the girls spent hours collecting the fast-growing nitrogen-fixing plants that Elara used to supplement the compost cycles. They worked in the dappled shade of the fruit trees, their baskets filling with green matter that would eventually become the soil for next year's crops. The heat was intense, but the abundance was undeniable. The corn was already head-high, its tassels catching the golden light of the late afternoon, and the bean vines were heavy with pods. This was the result of the careful engineering Elara had put into the soil, a balance of minerals and organic matter that had turned the rocky valley floor into a highly productive ecosystem. She taught the girls how to read the leaves for signs of nutrient deficiency, showing them the difference between a lack of potassium and the stress caused by the afternoon sun. These lessons were given with a gentle authority, Elara acting as a mentor who provided the tools for their own future independence. The water reclamation system was perhaps the most critical component of the homestead during the dry summer months. Every drop of gray water from the laundry in the kitchen was filtered through a series of gravel and sand beds before being pumped into the secondary irrigation tanks. Elara spent one afternoon with Caleb inspecting the biofilters, ensuring the bacterial colonies were healthy and the flow rate remained consistent. They moved with a synchronized rhythm, checking the pH levels and the clarity of the output. The system was a marvel of efficiency, a closed loop that ensured the homestead remained an island of green in a landscape that was increasingly parched and yellow. They spoke little during this work, the complexity of the task requiring their full concentration, but there was a sense of shared purpose that didn't need words. They were the architects of their own survival, the keepers of a delicate balance that kept the desert at bay. In the kitchen, the heavy, sweet scent of honey was pervasive as Elara and Sophie worked to harvest the first of the summer combs. The hives were located on the far edge of the orchard, away from the main activity of the house, and the bees were busy with the nectar from the wild clover and the garden flowers. Elara showed Sophie how to use the smoker to calm the bees, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid any sudden shifts that might cause agitation. They wore heavy protective suits, the white fabric reflecting the harsh sun, as they carefully lifted the frames from the boxes. The honey was thick and dark, a concentrated essence of the summer's growth. They took only what the colony could spare, ensuring the bees had enough stores to maintain their own health. Back in the house, they used a centrifugal extractor to pull the liquid gold from the wax, the rhythmic cranking of the handle a sound that would forever be associated with the abundance of the season. The evenings were long, the sun seemingly hesitant to drop below the jagged line of the mountains. During these hours, the homestead felt like a world unto itself, a self-contained unit of life and labor. Elara would often spend this time in her study, a small room lined with technical manuals and jars of seeds. She was meticulous in her record-keeping, noting the yields of the various crops and the performance of the electrical systems. She was building a database of knowledge that would ensure the homestead could continue to function for decades, regardless of what happened in the world beyond. She knew that the security she provided was not just about food and water. It was about the certainty of a future. She looked at the diagrams Caleb had drawn for a new gravity-fed irrigation line and felt a sense of profound satisfaction. They were not just surviving, they were thriving, building a life that was measured in the success of harvest and the stability of a power grid. The girls would sometimes sit on the edge of the porch, their legs dangling over the side as they watched the first stars appear in the deepening blue of the sky. Maya was often silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon, while Sophie would chatter about the new lambs or the size of the pumpkins in the garden. Elara would listen from the shadows of the doorway, her heart aching for the loss they carried, but her mind focused on the safety she could guarantee them. She never tried to force her way into their private world, never tried to be the mother they had lost. Instead, she was a steady presence in the background, the one who kept the lights on and the pantry full. She was the engineer of their peace, the one who had built a wall of technology and labor between them and the harshness of the outside world. She knew that Maya's heart was still hardened, a knot of resentment that she couldn't yet untie. But she also knew that the consistency of their life here would eventually provide the space for that knot to loosen. The workshop became a sanctuary for Caleb, a place where mechanical problems of the homestead provided a welcome distraction from the weight of the past. He had started a project to build a small, electric-powered cart for hauling firewood and heavy sacks of grain, using parts salvaged from an old utility vehicle and a high-torque motor Elara had in storage. The project was complex, requiring a deep understanding of gear ratios and battery management, and he spent hours bent over frame, his face smudged with grease and sweat. Elara would occasionally join him, offering a technical suggestion or helping him hold a heavy component in place. Their partnership was silent but robust, a connection forged in the shared reality of physical work. They were two people who had seen the world break and were now dedicated to building something that wouldn't. As the summer progressed, the air stayed dry and the heat remained constant. The high-gain season demanded a relentless pace of production, but it was a pace they had all come to accept. The processing of the grain harvest was the next major task, the stalks of wheat and barley turning a brilliant, pale gold in the fields. Elara and Caleb spent days in the sun, using the small mechanical reaper to cut the crop before hauling it back to the threshing floor. The air was filled with the dust of the chaff and the sweet, earthy smell of the grain. They worked until their muscles ached and their skin was burned bronze by the sun, the sheer volume of the harvest a testament to the success of their systems. The girls helped with the winnowing, using the breeze to separate the grain from the husks, their laughter occasionally breaking through the focused silence of the work. It was a scene of ancient labor supported by modern technology, a synthesis of the old and the new that defined the homestead. The flour mill Caleb had serviced was put to the test, the heavy stones turning with a low, rhythmic grumble as they ground the fresh grain into fine, nutritious flour. The smell of baking bread soon filled the house, a comforting, domestic scent that seemed to anchor them even more firmly to the earth. Elara taught Sophie how to manage the sourdough starter, a living culture of wild yeast that was as much a part of the homestead as the goats or the garden. They made large batches of bread, some for immediate consumption, and some to be sliced and dried into hardtack for long-term storage. This was the true meaning of the summer, the conversion of sunlight and water into the calories that would sustain them. Every jar of preserves, every wheel of cheese, and every sack of grain was a victory against the uncertainty of the future. Despite the intensity of the work, there were moments of quiet reflection. Elara would sometimes find herself standing in the middle of the garden at dusk, the air finally still and the heat radiating from the ground. She would look up at the dome, the transparent material catching the last of the light, and feel a sense of immense responsibility. She had created this place, this sanctuary, and she was the one who had to ensure it remained standing. She looked at the house, where the golden light of the LEDs glowed through the windows, and saw the silhouettes of the family she had taken in. She knew that the resentment Maya felt was a shadow in the corner of this bright world, a darkness that she couldn't simply switch off. She had to wait, to be patient, and to continue providing the stability that would eventually allow Maya to find her own way back to the light. The homestead was more than just a collection of systems. It was a living entity that required constant care and attention. The summer heat was a challenge, but it was also the fuel that drove their growth. The solar panels provided an excess of power that Elara used to run the large-scale dehydrators and the cooling systems, ensuring that nothing went to waste. She was a master of efficiency, always looking for ways to optimize the flow of energy and nutrients. She saw the world as a series of interconnected cycles, and her role was to ensure that those cycles remained unbroken. This perspective was what allowed her to remain calm in the face of the heat and the hard work. She knew that as long as the systems were maintained, they were safe. The girls were becoming more attuned to the rhythms of the homestead. They knew when the goats needed to be milked, when the garden needed to be watered, and when the solar batteries were reaching their peak charge. They were no longer just observers. They were participants in their own survival. This transition was subtle but profound, a shift from the helplessness of their earlier life to the agency they now possessed. Elara watched this change with quiet pride, knowing that she was giving them something that no one could ever take away, the knowledge of how to live. She saw in the way Sophie handled the animals with confidence and the way Maya approached the technical tasks in the workshop with a focused intensity. They were becoming the crew of the homestead, a unit that functioned with increasing harmony, even if the underlying emotional tensions remained unresolved. The night air was often filled with the sound of the cicadas, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to mirror the heartbeat of the summer. In the quiet of the evening, Elara would sometimes sit in the living room, the digital displays of the power system casting a soft blue glow over the space. She would think about the mother the girls had lost, the woman whose place she was inadvertently occupying in Maya's eyes. She understood the pain of that loss, the way it could turn the most well-intentioned act into a perceived threat. She didn't want to be their mother. She wanted to be their protector, the one who ensured they never had to face that kind of loss again. She hoped that in time, Maya would see the difference, that she would realize Elara wasn't trying to erase the past, but to build a future where the past could be remembered without fear. The high summer season continued without pause, the sun a constant presence that defined the boundaries of their lives. The work was demanding, but it was also rewarding. They were building a world where the water was clean, the food was abundant, and the light stayed on. It was a world of their own making, a sanctuary of technology and labor that stood as a defiance against the chaos outside. Elara, Caleb, and the girls were the inhabitants of this world, a small community bound together by the necessity of survival and the hope of something more. The heat would eventually break. The days would eventually shorten. But for now, they were held in the amber light of the summer, a time of growth and preservation that would define the rest of their lives. They were safe, they were working, and they were, in their own complicated way, becoming a family. The Alaskan summer reached its peak with persistent, heavy heat that hovered in the high 80s, an atmospheric weight that felt far more intense under the slanted, unrelenting rays of sun that refused to set. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the air was thick with the scent of pine resin and the damp, earthy hum of the muskeg. Unlike the dry heat of the south, this was a humid, tactile warmth that clung to skin and made every physical task a test of endurance. The solar array was working at its maximum capacity, but the challenge now was managing the thermal load on the batteries themselves. The ambient temperature in the valley meant the cooling fans of the power inverters ran constantly, their mechanical drone blending with the distant rush of the Meltwater Creek. There was no mention of weeks or months. The time was measured only by the height of the sun as it performed its slow, circular dance along the jagged edges of the northern peaks. Elara adjusted the ventilation parameters for the main house, focusing on the movement of air during the brief, golden hours of night, when the sun dipped just low enough to turn the sky into a bruised purple. She utilized the thermal mass of the foundation to sink the day's heat, ensuring the sleeping quarters remained at a steady 68 degrees. Her role remained one of quiet, logistical support. She monitored the hydration levels of the group with the same precision she applied to the garden's nutrient cycles, ensuring that cold infusions of fireweed and mint were always available in the kitchen. She watched the girls and Caleb with a steady, empathetic eye, recognizing the physical toll the long days were taking. She never pushed for more than they could give, but she ensured that the environment she provided was one of absolute safety and predictable comfort. She was the anchor that allowed them to navigate the intensity of the season without feeling adrift in the vastness of the wilderness. Caleb was focused on the technical requirements of the midsummer harvest. The long hours of daylight had pushed the greenhouse production into overdrive, and the biomass was accumulating faster than the standard composting cycles could handle. He worked with Maya to calibrate the methane digester, a system Elara had designed to convert organic waste into clean cooking gas. The work was demanding and required a high degree of technical accuracy to maintain the proper anaerobic balance. They spent hours monitoring the pressure gauges and the temperature of the slurry, their movements synchronized as they moved through the maintenance checklists. Caleb's background in complex systems allowed him to understand the delicate interplay of the biology and the machinery, and he treated Maya like a junior engineer, explaining the why behind every adjustment. There was no talk of his former life or the world beyond the valley. There was only the pressure in the tank and the efficiency of the burn. Inside the kitchen, Elara managed the high-volume production of the dairy stores. The goats were thriving on the lush, high-latitude forage, and the milk was exceptionally rich. She spent several hours each day in the processing station she had built, a space that smelled of steam and clean stainless steel. The production of the powdered heavy cream was a primary focus. She used a large-scale centrifugal separator to pull the thick cream from the milk before spreading it onto the dehydration trays. The process in this humidity required a slower, more controlled temperature curve to ensure the fats didn't separate before the moisture was removed. She would later grind the brittle sheets of cream into a fine, shelf-stable powder, vacuum sealing into blocks that felt like ivory in her hands. This was a vital part of her strategy, converting the temporary abundance of the summer into long-term security. Sophie had become the primary tender of the indoor garden. Her days spent managing the vertical hydroponic towers that grew the leafy greens and herbs. The heat made the greenhouse feel like a tropical rainforest, and Sophie moved through the rows with a handheld sensor, checking the electrical conductivity of the water and the pH levels of the reservoirs. She had developed a deep intuition for the health of the plants, noticing the slightest curl in a leaf or a change in color before the sensors even registered a deviation. Elara supported her by providing the technical framework, the nutrient mixes, and the lighting schedules. But she let Sophie take the lead on the daily management. It was a way of giving the girl a sense of agency and ownership over a part of their survival, a small but significant piece of the world that she could control. Maya's technical contributions were centered on the homestead's electrical infrastructure. The high-latitude sun meant the solar panels were generating an enormous surplus of energy, and Maya worked with Elara to divert that power into the secondary thermal storage units. They were using the excess electricity to heat large tanks of water that would provide radiant heat during the cooler months, a project that required a sophisticated understanding of heat exchange cycles and pump controllers. Maya was focused and efficient, her hands steady as she wired the new sensors into the central bus. The resentment she felt toward Elara was a quiet, cold thing that lived beneath the surface of her technical competence. She accepted the safety and the structure Elara provided, but she viewed it through the lens of a person who felt her own history was being replaced by a new, engineered reality. Elara recognized this and kept her interactions professional and supportive, never demanding an emotional warmth that Maya wasn't ready to give. The technical complexity of the water reclamation system remained a priority as the heat continued. The primary filters had to be backflushed more frequently to handle the increased load of organic matter from the heavy irrigation. Caleb and Elara spent one afternoon disassembling the main manifold to replace a worn seal, a task that required them to work in the cramped, cool space of the utility vault. They moved with a practiced ease, their hands working in tandem to secure the heavy bolts. Caleb's strength and Elara's precision made them a highly effective team. They spoke in the shorthand of technicians, numbers, pressures, and torque specs, their collaboration a testament to the functional stability they had achieved. They were the architects of a world that worked, and that shared reality was the foundation of their relationship. The diet on the homestead was a mix of the fresh and the preserved. Meals were often served in the late evening when the sun was low enough to cast long, golden shadows across the floor. They ate large bowls of fresh greens from Sophie's garden, topped with the soft cheeses Elara made from a morning's milk. The bread was thick and dark, made from the grain they had processed earlier in the season, and served with a dollop of the reconstituted heavy cream. The conversation at the table was quiet and focused on the day's achievements. There was no nastiness in their interactions, only the calm, measured dialogue of people who knew their survival depended on their cooperation. Elara made sure the atmosphere remained one of safety and mutual respect, a place where the girls could feel the permanence of their new home. The workshop had become the center of the homestead's mechanical life. Caleb had finished the electric haul cart and was now a vital tool for moving heavy loads of compost and firewood. He and Maya had even added a series of ruggedized cargo racks and a reinforced suspension system to handle the uneven terrain of the valley. The cart was powered by the surplus solar energy, making it a nearly silent and zero-cost addition to their logistics. When they used it to move the heavy blocks of salt for the livestock, the hum of the electric motor was the only sound in the afternoon stillness. It was a tangible symbol of their progress, a piece of technology that made the hard work of the Alaskan summer just a little bit easier. The evenings were never truly dark. The sun would linger just below the horizon, creating a civil twilight that lasted for hours. During this time, the valley was filled with a strange, ethereal light that turned the mountains into silhouettes of deep indigo. Elara would often walk the perimeter of the garden, checking the tension on the trellis wires and ensuring the automated irrigation was delivering the correct amount of water to the base of plants. She felt a deep sense of responsibility for the people inside the house. She had built the walls and systems, but she also knew she was building the emotional framework of their lives. She wanted them to know that they were okay, that the world was no longer a place where things were taken away without warning. She was a guardian of their stability, the engineer who had accounted for every variable except the time it would take for a young girl's heart to heal. The work of preserving the harvest continued at a relentless pace. Elara and Sophie spent hours processing the wild berries that grew in the clearings around the homestead, lingonberries and crowberries that were packed with antioxidants and vitamins. They turned the fruit into dense, leather-like strips in jars of low-sugar preserves. Elara showed Sophie how to use the refractometer to check the sugar content, ensuring the preserves would remain shelf-stable without the need for excessive amounts of honey. This was the work of the high summer, capturing the fleeting energy of the sun and locking it away in glass and mylar. It was a cycle of reduction that felt ancient and vital, a rhythm that connected them to the land in a way that nothing else could. Maya's resentment was most visible in her silence. She did everything that was asked of her, and often more, but she did it with a detachment that was palpable. She avoided the family areas when she wasn't working, retreating to the sleeping quarters she shared with Sophie. Elara knew that Maya was holding on to the memory of her mother like a shield, afraid that if she allowed herself to find happiness or comfort in this new life, she would be betraying the woman she had lost. Elara didn't try to argue with this feeling. She simply continued to provide the safety and the resources that Maya needed. She ensured that Maya had access to the books and the technical data she craved, and she made sure the girl's physical needs were always met without question. She was playing the long game, knowing that consistency and safety were the only cures for the kind of trauma Maya had experienced. The technical maintenance of the dome itself was an ongoing task. The high temperatures caused the structural elements to expand, and Elara had to periodically check the tension on the support cables and the integrity of the seals. She and Caleb spent several hours on the service catwalks, their tether harnesses clinking against the metal as they moved. The view from the top of the dome was spectacular. The entire valley was a lush, green bowl surrounded by the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the range. From this height, the homestead looked like a perfect, self-contained organism, a jewel of technology in the middle of the wilderness. They were the caretakers of this organism, and as they worked, there was a sense of profound satisfaction in the clarity of their purpose. The Alaskan summer was a season of extremes. Extreme light, extreme growth, and extreme heat of the high 80s that pushed their systems to the limit. But the homestead held. The water flowed, the batteries remained charged, and the pantry was filling with the fruits of their labor. Elara, Caleb, and the girls were living in a world that was safe and predictable, a world where the future was something they were actively building with their own hands. The resentment that Maya felt was a lingering shadow, but it was a shadow in a world that was increasingly filled with light. They were a crew, a family in the making, and they were all, in their own way, beginning to believe that they were going to be okay. The sun continued its relentless, low-altitude arc across the Alaskan sky, never truly setting, but instead bruising the horizon with a deep, persistent amber that lasted through the midnight hours. The ambient temperature remained in the high 80s, a heavy, humid warmth that drew the moisture out of surrounding muskeg and filled the valley with a hazy, shimmering light. The growth of the vegetation was almost aggressive. The fireweed had shot up to 6 feet, its magenta blossoms vibrating with the frantic energy of the bees, while the garden inside the perimeter had become a dense, leafy jungle. There was no discussion of time, no marking of the weeks that had passed since the first thaw. There was only the constant, technical demand of the high production season. The homestead functioned at peak capacity. Every system from the solar array to the water filtration beds running hot and steady to keep pace with the explosion of biomass and the thermal load of the long days. Elara focused her efforts on the large-scale preservation of the summer's protein and fat. The dairy production had reached a point of surplus that required a more industrial approach to storage. She spent the better part of 3 days in the kitchen's processing bay, which was cooled by a dedicated heat pump that hummed with a low, industrial throb. She was perfecting the production of the powdered heavy cream, a high-density calorie source that would be essential for the winter. The process was exacting. The cream was separated, pasteurized, and then spread onto specialized non-stick sheets in the high-capacity dehydrators. Elara monitored the humidity levels within the units with a digital hygrometer, ensuring the air exchange was sufficient to prevent the fats from oxidizing before they reached a stable, dry state. Once the cream was brittle, she processed it in the heavy-duty planetary mill until it reached a uniform, velvety texture. She worked with a calm, methodical precision, her hands moving through the steps of the process with the confidence of someone who designed every aspect of her environment. Caleb was preoccupied with the structural maintenance of the irrigation intake. The glacial meltwater in the creek had increased with the heat wave, bringing down a higher-than-usual amount of fine, silted glacial flour that threatened to clog the primary filters. He spent hours waist-deep in the cold water, his body a stark contrast to the shimmering heat of the air as he installed a series of pre-filter screens made of stainless steel mesh. He worked with a steady, quiet focus, his technical aptitude for fluid systems allowing him to troubleshoot the flow rate issues before they impacted the greenhouse. He and Elara had developed a shorthand for these repairs, a technical dialogue that bypasses the need for social fluff. They spoke of micron ratings and pressure differentials, their collaboration a solid, reliable foundation for the household's survival. He was no longer a man out of place. He was the lead technician of his own sanctuary. Sophie had become the master of the green loop, the system of nutrient reclamation that kept the soil productive. Under Elara's mentorship, she had taken over management of the vermicompost bins and the liquid fertilizer fermenters. The heat had accelerated the biological processes, and Sophie monitored the temperature of the compost piles with long-stem probes, ensuring the aerobic bacteria were thriving without overheating the core. She treated the soil with the same care one might treat a living animal, understanding that the health of the plants was directly tied to the microbiology of the earth. Elara provided the technical baseline, the nitrogen-to-carbon ratios, and the moisture percentages, but Sophie provided the daily vigilance. She moved through the garden with a quiet, observing grace, her hands stained with the dark, rich humus that she had helped create. Maya's role had shifted into the maintenance of the homestead's digital and electrical backbone. With the 20-hour sun, the solar charge controllers were under a constant load, and she worked with Elara to optimize the battery balancing cycles. They sat together in the cool, dimmed light of the power room, their faces illuminated by the flickering green and blue of the system monitors. Maya's proficiency with control software was evident. She could navigate the submenus and adjust the voltage thresholds with a speed that rivaled Elara's. Despite her technical engagement, the resentment she felt toward Elara remained a silent, palpable barrier. It was not a matter of nastiness or outward hostility, but cold, internal distance. She accepted the safety and the logic of Elara's world, but she viewed Elara herself as a functional replacement for the emotional core of her family, a replacement she wasn't ready to acknowledge. Elara, sensing this, maintained a respectful and professional demeanor, offering praise for Maya's technical accuracy without encroaching on her emotional space. The domestic economy was humming with the production of textiles and long-term storage goods. The carding machine and the loom were in constant use, processing the wool from the spring, shearing into heavy, dense blankets that would serve as thermal barriers. Elara had modified the loom with a digital counter to track the yardage, and she and Maya worked together to tension the warp for the latest batch of insulation fabric. The repetitive, mechanical nature of the work provided a steadying rhythm to the long, hot days. They were building a surplus of everything: food, fuel, fiber, and power. Elara's goal was to ensure that the homestead was not just surviving the summer, but over-providing for a future where the resources might not be so abundant. She was a provider of safety in its most tangible form, a woman who believed that a well-stocked pantry and a functioning electrical grid were the ultimate expressions of care. The diet on the homestead was a testament to their self-sufficiency. They ate a rotating menu of fresh harvested vegetables, goat cheese, and the sourdough bread that had become a staple of their lives. Elara had mastered the art of making a dense, high-protein flatbread that utilized the powdered milk and cream she produced, creating a calorie-dense meal that sustained them to the physical labor of the day. They ate in the shaded breezeway, the air kept in motion by the large, slow-moving ceiling fans that Elara had salvaged and repaired. The conversation was functional and grounded in immediate tasks: the state of the battery banks, the yield of the latest potato harvest, or the maintenance schedule for the electric cart. It was the talk of a crew that understood the mechanics of their world, a group of people who had found a common language in the work. The thermal management of the house was a constant technical challenge during the peak of the heat. Elara had designed a passive cooling system that utilized the cold meltwater from the creek, running it through a series of copper coils located in the air intake of the ventilation system. During the hottest part of the afternoon, she and Caleb would monitor the temperature differential, ensuring the heat exchange was working efficiently. It was a simple but effective piece of engineering that kept the interior of the dome at a comfortable temperature without draining the battery banks. The girls spent their mid-afternoons in the cool of the common area, reading or working on smaller handcrafts, protected from the intense UV radiation of the high-latitude sun. This was the sanctuary Elara had promised, a place where the environment was controlled and the dangers of the outside world were kept at bay by technology and foresight. Caleb's work on the electric haul cart had proven to be one of the most significant upgrades to their daily operations. The cart was now equipped with a heavy-duty winch and a series of ruggedized cargo containers, allowing them to move hundreds of pounds of supplies with minimal physical effort. He and Maya had spent one afternoon calibrating the regenerative braking system on the steeper slopes of the valley, ensuring that the energy spent climbing was partially recovered on the descent. It was a project that required a high degree of technical collaboration, and seeing the two of them working together over the motor controller was a sight that gave Elara a quiet sense of hope. They were building a shared history of success, one mechanical fix at a time. As the sun performed its endless circle, the landscape around them transformed. The green of the valley was so vibrant it seemed almost artificial, a neon contrast to the gray stone of the mountains. The humidity of the muskeg brought with it a thick, heavy air that muffled the sounds of the wilderness, making the homestead feel even more isolated and self-contained. Elara took several walk-arounds each day, checking the structural integrity of the greenhouse and the tension on the wind turbine guy wires. She moved with the steady, unhurried pace of a person who knew exactly how much work was required to maintain this level of stability. She was the engineer of their piece, the one who saw the potential for failure in every loose bolt or fluctuating voltage, and corrected it before it could become a crisis. The work of the high summer was a marathon production. They processed hundreds of pounds of vegetables, vacuum sealing, and blanching them for the deep freeze units. They harvested the wild herbs and dried them in the solar kilns, filling glass jars with the concentrated scents of the Alaskan summer. Every task was performed with an eye toward the long term, a realization that the abundance they were seeing now was the fuel for their future. Elara led by example, her stamina and technical focus setting the tone for the household. She was empathetic to the exhaustion the others felt, ensuring they had adequate rest and that the work was distributed fairly, but she never let the standard of maintenance slip. The safety of the homestead was a non-negotiable requirement. Maya's resentment, while still present, was becoming a predictable element of the domestic landscape. She was a dedicated worker, a brilliant technical mind, and a reliable member of the crew. Her distance was her own, a space she inhabited to protect her memory of her mother. Elara respected this, knowing that time and consistency were her only tools in bridging that gap. She didn't need Maya to love her. She needed Maya to be safe and to contribute to the success of the homestead. The emotional resolution was a distant goal, something that would happen in its own time. For now, the focus remained on the high-gain production of the summer, the constant maintenance of systems, and the steady, quiet work of building a life in the northern wilderness. The evenings, if they could be called that, were a time of quiet reflection. They would sit on the porch, the air finally losing some of its humid weight as the sun reached its lowest point. The sky was a kaleidoscope of orange, pink, and deep violet, the light reflecting off the surface of the dome and the solar panels. They were a small island of humanity in a vast, indifferent landscape, but they were an island that worked. They had power, water, food, and shelter. They had a purpose and a plan. Elara looked at Caleb and the girls and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had taken a broken situation and engineered a solution that was robust and sustainable. They were okay, and as the endless summer light bathed the valley in its golden glow, that was the only truth that mattered. The technical complexity of their lives was not a burden, but a framework that provided meaning. Every repaired sensor, every process jar of cream, and every kilowatt hour stored was a brick in a wall they were building against the chaos of the world. They were the masters of their own environment, the operators of a sophisticated habitat that provided them with everything they needed. As the heat of the afternoon faded into the long, bright twilight, the homestead stood as a testament to their labor and Elara's vision. They were safe, they were working, and they were one technical task at a time, finding their way toward a state of coexistence. I have maintained the strict high-latitude summer setting, focusing on the 20-hour sun and the technical production of the homestead. Elara remains an empathetic provider, and Maya's resentment is kept as a background technical and social friction, setting the stage for the resolution in the final part. The sun had finally begun to lose its aggressive vertical intensity, though it still refused to leave the sky, hanging in a permanent state of gilded twilight that stretched the shadows of the spruce trees across the valley floor. The heat wave had leveled off into a consistent mellow warmth in the low 80s, and the air carried a crispness that suggested the peak of the atmospheric moisture was beginning to settle. On the homestead, the high-intensity production of the summer had transitioned into a stable rhythm of maintenance and quietude. The solar batteries were topped off by mid-afternoon. The pantry was a fortress of vacuum-sealed proteins and powdered dairy, and the technical systems were humming in a state of near-perfect equilibrium. For the first time since the thaw, the physical pressure of survival had eased enough to allow the emotional architecture of the family to come into focus. Elara remained the steady, empathetic core of this environment, never demanding gratitude, but continuing to ensure that the space she had built was one where happiness was not just a possibility, but a right. Maya's resentment had reached a quiet, pressurized peak. For months, she had functioned as a high-level technician, her hands building the very world she felt was an insult to her mother's memory. To Maya, every success Elara engineered, the cool air, the abundant food, the safety, felt like a brick being laid over the grave of her past life. She saw Elara's competence not as a gift, but as a replacement, a functional upgrade that made her mother's absence feel permanent. She spent her off hours in the sleeping quarters, staring at the empty nightstand between her and Sophie's beds. The silence of the house, which felt like peace to Caleb and Elara, felt like a void to Maya. She was a girl trapped between the necessity of the present and the loyalty she felt toward the woman who was no longer there to protect her. The resolution began not with a confrontation, but with a technical workaround. Elara had maintained the Starlink terminal as a vital link for weather data and system updates, but she had never restricted the girls' access to the broader network. One evening, while the rest of the house was quiet, Maya sat at the workstation in the study. Her intent was not to rebel, but to reclaim. She navigated through the cached remains of the old world, the digital ghosts of social media infrastructure that was still partially functional in the cloud. She found her mother's Facebook page, a static, frozen archive of a life lived before the world broke. With a steady hand, she began to download every photo she could find. Her mother laughing in a sun-drenched kitchen, her mother holding a newborn Sophie, her mother standing on a hiking trail with the same jagged mountains in the background that now surrounded the homestead. Maya didn't tell anyone what she was doing. She used the workshop's 3D printer and a spare tablet interface to construct a dedicated digital picture frame, her technical skills finally serving a purpose that was entirely her own. She spent hours soldering the power lead and housing the electronics in a clean, wooden frame she had carved from birch. On a warm evening, when the light in the valley was a soft, bruised purple, Maya placed a frame on the nightstand between the two beds. When Sophie came in to sleep, the screen flickered to life, cycling through a loop of their mother's face, vibrant, present, and smiling. The two girls sat on the edge of the bed in the glow of the screen, the digital light reflecting in their eyes. For the first time in the new world, their mother was not a painful memory to be guarded, but a presence that was allowed to exist alongside their new reality. Elara found Maya in the hallway shortly after. The girl was leaning against the wall, her shoulders shaking with the silent release of months of guarded anger and grief. Elara didn't offer a lecture on survival or illicit chores. She simply stood there, a steady and non-threatening presence. When Maya looked up, the coldness in her eyes had been replaced by a raw, exhausted clarity. She realized that Elara wasn't trying to be her mother, and she wasn't trying to erase the past. Elara was the person who had built the walls that kept them safe enough to finally mourn. Maya moved forward and collapsed into Elara, a sudden, desperate hug that broke the last of the friction between them. They stood there in the quiet of the homestead, the hum of the ventilation system a steady heartbeat in the background, as the resentment finally dissolved into a hard-won truce. It was a birth of coexistence, a realization that they could honor the dead while still choosing to live. The following afternoon, the atmosphere on the homestead had shifted. The air felt lighter, the silence no longer a void but a shared space of comfort. To celebrate the completion of the summer's primary harvest and the new peace within the house, Caleb suggested they take a break from the mechanical and domestic labor. He led them down to the large, engineered pond at the base of the valley, a body of water Elara had stocked with trout and aerated with a solar-powered bubbling system. The pond was a sapphire jewel in the middle of the green valley, its surface undisturbed except for the occasional ripple of a rising fish. They brought with them simple fishing gear, rods Caleb had repaired in the forge, and a small container of bait from the compost bins. They sat along the grassy bank, the sun still warm on their backs but no longer oppressive. Elara sat next to Caleb, her eyes moving across the water with a sense of profound satisfaction. She watched Sophie and Maya sitting together, their heads close as they discussed the best way to cast their lines. There was no technical data to record, no voltage to monitor, and no biomass to process. They were simply four people in a beautiful place, existing in the same moment without the weight of the past or the fear of the future pulling them apart. The pond, like everything else on the homestead, was a product of their labor and Elara's foresight, but in this moment, it was just a place to be together. Caleb was the first to catch something, a flash of silver breaking the surface as he reeled in a healthy, spotted trout. The girls cheered, the sound of their laughter echoing off the stone walls of the valley. It was a sound that had been missing from the homestead for a long time, a sound of genuine, uncomplicated happiness. Maya caught the next one, her technical precision translating perfectly to the timing of the hook set. She held the fish up for Elara to see, a genuine smile breaking across her face. It wasn't a smile of victory over Elara, but a smile of shared success. They were a team, a crew that had survived the most difficult transition of their lives and had come out the other side as something new. As the night sun began its slow, horizontal crawl back toward the east, they packed up their gear. They had enough fish for a fresh dinner, a supplement to preserve stores they had worked so hard to build. They walked back toward the house together, the four of them moving in a loose, comfortable line. They looked back at the pond and the valley, seeing the homestead not as a series of technical challenges to be overcome, but as a home that they had earned. The mountains stood as silent sentinels around them, but they no longer felt like walls of prison. They felt like the boundaries of a sanctuary. In the kitchen, they prepared the meal together. Maya and Sophie handled the cleaning of the fish, while Elara and Caleb prepared the fresh vegetables and the sourdough. The house was filled with the scent of wood smoke and frying fish, a domestic aroma that signaled the end of the high summer's intensity. They ate with a sense of quiet celebration, the digital picture frame in the other room still glowing with the images of the woman who had brought them here, in spirit if not in body. They were no longer running from anything. They were stationary, grounded, and secure. Elara sat at the head of the table, looking at the faces of the people she had protected. She knew that there would be more challenges, mechanical failures, harsh weather, and the long-term realities of their isolation, but she also knew that they were ready. The infrastructure of their lives was robust, and the emotional foundation was finally in place. They had moved beyond the loop of survival and into the reality of living. They were a family of choice, a group of individuals who had engineered a second chance at happiness in the middle of the wilderness. As the golden light of the persistent sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the table, a sense of deep, settled peace took hold. The work of the summer was done. The conflict had been faced and resolved not through force, but through empathy and the reclamation of memory. They were more than just a collection of survivors. They were the inhabitants of a new world, one where the light stayed on and the heart was allowed to heal. They looked at each other, the shared understanding of their journey passing between them, without the need for words. They were okay. They were more than okay. They were home.